I used to operate under the naive assumption that if there was one thing the Baldur's Gate 3 fandom was united on, it was that Karlach is a precious angel who's done nothing wrong and deserves the world. Since starting this YouTube channel, however, I've brushed up against some people who openly dislike her, and at least one person who actually thinks she's like a literal biblical demon from hell, but that's besides the point. It's too early in the video to get sidetracked. The point is that our resident barbarian with golden retriever energy is surprisingly polarizing, and some of the main complaints I've seen levied at her are that her ending is disappointing, she lacks character growth or evolution, and she's in desperate need of additional content. I'm actually in agreement with pretty much all of these criticisms to varying extents, but as with all things Baldur's Gate 3, there's more to this story than what we see in the full release of the game. We've talked a lot about what the early access version of Baldur's Gate looked like on this channel, and we've dreamed up a lot of rewrites for characters and their personal plots. Today, we're going to be doing both of those things for Karlach, and I'm pretty excited about it. Because outside of Will, she's undoubtedly the character who received the biggest makeover between early access and the full release of the game, both in appearance and personality. Not only that, but her story may have been rather unfortunately tethered to a massive portion of Act 3, which ended up being cut from the game in its entirety. I'd like to shed some light on how that might have happened, and what her story might have looked like if it didn't, and I'll be doing that by straightforwardly reporting on the facts and baselessly speculating on nothing but my hopes and dreams. That's right, friends. The tinfoil hats are back.
This better be violent, sexy, or both.
So prepare for spoilers for all 3 acts of Baldur's Gate 3 as I rant to you about Karlach Cliffgate, what was, what is, and what could have been. Oh, and I'm sorry if you guys are hearing little like drippy drops of water. It's been raining for days here and I couldn't put off recording any longer, so I don't know, maybe it'll be like a little ASMR video. Okay, let's go. Part 1. What was? Karlach was more of a vague concept than an actual character for the bulk of early access. She was part of the game well before the barbarian class or the bigger body types were implemented, and as such, she looked like this for the majority of the early access play period.
No sudden movements or you're dead.
We didn't know any better back in those days, but looking at her now, it's almost like a jump scare hearing Samantha Bayart's clear, brassy voice come out of this character model and seeing her stand in Karlach's place on the riverbank. Like, who even is that? It's so uncanny.
That motherfucker back there is not real!
This model was always meant to be a placeholder. There are quite a few great concept pieces in the game's official art book, and enterprising data miners were actually able to dig up an alternate face model in-game, one that was supposedly originally intended to be her final look. The face model in question is this one, and I mean, I'm not mad at it. The aforementioned art book also includes the interesting tidbit that while Karlach was always supposed to be a barbarian, they did briefly consider making her a sorcerer or a paladin, which is so interesting to me. Like, don't get me wrong, I love her as a barbarian, but could you imagine an Oath of Vengeance paladin Karlach? Like, come on. Something to think about for my next playthrough, I guess. An important note is that early access Karlach's story was much simpler. She was still a fugitive being chased by Zariel's lackeys, but her quest was streamlined. She menaced you with a crossbow, and you had to pass a check for her to lower it. Upon gaining her tentative trust, she'd enlist you to fight off the fake Tyrans which had taken over the toll house. But because of her injuries, she wouldn't come with you to help take them down. Once you returned to her, she'd thank you and tell you she's heading back home to Baldur's Gate. She'd allude to having some kind of score to settle with some politicians, plural, and urge you to stay away from the city. And then she'd just walk away, never to be heard from again.
When I catch up with them, the streets will run red.
If Samantha Bayart sounds a little unsure of her lines and her character here, that's because she probably was. Karlach's character wasn't totally cemented until pretty far into the development timeline, because she had to be rewritten around the same time that Will was. And if you've watched my Will video, then you know that actor Theo Solomon was hired in December of 2022 for the role of Will. He only had about 9 months to complete most of his mocap and voice lines, whereas most of the other actors had been working with Larian for nearly 4 years. Evidently, it was the same for Bayart, which makes sense given how entwined those two stories are. Though she had begun voicing the unfinished version of Karlach back in 2020, she was brought back in December of 2022 to record all new lines. And between those 2 points in time, Karlach went from being a pretty outwardly violent and jaded person, singularly driven toward revenge, to the woman that we see in the full release. And I assume that this is also the reason that her face model was changed. Data-mined Karlach looks slightly older and more world-weary, which would have been a better fit for her early access personality, while full-release Karlach looks more like a bouncing ball of happy energy because she is. It's a testament to Bayart's skills as an actor that Karlach was received as well as she was on release, especially when you consider the limited time frame that she was given to work on the character. Her personality just really shines through in every sentence that she speaks. Of course, Karlach's lead writer, Sarah Bayless, also deserves a huge chunk of the credit here. While I do have plenty of critiques to make, it should be noted up top that Bayless did an incredible job realizing our big, soft tiefling, especially given all the potential roadblocks that occurred during development, and all the allegedly cut content left behind along the way to the game's release. But we can't really talk about that stuff until we talk about what's actually in the game, so without further ado, let's do that. It's a stupid joke. Cut it out. Part 2. What is? In the full release of Baldur's Gate 3, Karlach Cliffgate was orphaned in Baldur's Gate as a child. She would eventually take a job working for a young Enver Gortash who would ultimately betray her and sell her down the river Styx to the archdevil Zariel. And she'd spend the next decade of her young life fighting against her will in the Blood War, an endless conflict waged in the Hells between devils and demons. Then, when the Nautiloid crashed through the Hells, Karlach saw an opportunity and took it. She hacked and slashed her way through Zariel's forces, and as she rushed toward the ship, the famed Blade of Frontiers was set on her tail to prevent her escape. But instead of obtaining his target, the blade was targeted himself and snatched up by the Nautiloid. Karlach hitched a ride, being infected with a Mind Flayer tadpole in the process, and eventually found herself alone somewhere on the Sword Coast after the ship crashed there.
If it looks like the Sword Coast, smells like the Sword Coast, and feels like the fucking Sword Coast.
Zariel immediately sent servants to find Karlach and return her to Avernus. Disguised as paladins of Tyr, they hunted her down, but like the Blade, they were unable to capture or kill her. And that is where the player comes in. Just by the nature of the way the game map is laid out, most players meet Will before Karlach, and he convinces the player that she's a bloodthirsty devil, since that's what Mizora has been whispering in his ear. He wants her head, and so do the fake paladins of Tyr, but upon meeting Karlach, it becomes very clear that she is not the monster that she's been made out to be. Intimidating? Sure. Hot-headed? Absolutely. Physically capable? Certainly.
She looks like she could throw me over her shoulder and carry me to safety, should the need arise.
And so the player must decide what to do in this strange predicament. If you kill Karlach and take her head, the Paladins award you the Sword of Justice, and Will gets an armor upgrade from Mizora, though he's racked with guilt about it. He second-guesses himself and Mizora's orders, coming to understand that he outright murdered an innocent tiefling. But if you choose to protect Karlach, then you already know what happens. The paladins are swiftly dispatched, the toll house goes up in flames, Will gets a shiny new pair of horns for disobeying his patron, and, most importantly, Karlach gets to live. And the circumstances of that life, and whether or not she gets to keep living it, end up being the focal point of her story. As you probably know, Karlach has an infernal engine embedded in her chest in place of her heart, and the longer she remains on the material plane, the hotter it burns. And so it becomes imperative to find a mechanic who can work with the machine, lest Karlach go out in a blaze of hellfire. Luckily, Damon, a tiefling refugee at the Grove, is that mechanic, and he's able to use a piece of infernal iron to stabilize Karlach's heart. At least temporarily. He makes it clear in the game's second act that, as far as he can tell, there is no permanent solution to this, and Karlach will eventually need to return to Avernus if she wants to keep living. I find this concept to be incredibly cool, and linking a barbarian's rage mechanic to a story-relevant plot device is just... it's great video game storytelling, in my humble little opinion. And I also find the choice to weave Will and Karlach's stories so tightly together to be really fascinating from a development standpoint. Not only does it give the pair of them a much stronger bond than any of the other characters in-game, but it also helps to shore up their individual quests to make them seem more robust than they actually are. For instance, in Act 2, after we've given Karlach's heart her second upgrade, there's really nothing left for her to do, but because she and Mizora have a pre-established relationship as unhappy bedfellows at Zariel's court, it feels like part of Karlach's story when Mizora shows up and demands Will free her from the clutches of the Absolute. And of course, they can be a huge part of each other's endings. There's a lot of discourse about which of Karlach's endings is actually best for her, and What I find really cool about that is your opinion probably depends on what you think her story is actually about, because unlike some of our other companions, Karlach's deeper themes are a little less cut and dry. Some players see her story as one about confronting the inevitability of death and being at peace with it, and therefore they believe that allowing her to perish in a blaze of glory on the docks is best, since she's finally able to say goodbye and become a beacon of light for lost souls on the fugue plane. Others think her story is about confronting her fears, learning to live with trauma and misfortune, and finding hope when everything seems hopeless. So sending her back into Avernus with Will is the best ending, since she gets to keep living with a friend by her side, and the looming promise of getting better one day. And a scattered handful of people think squidifying Karlach is the best ending because, I don't know, you guys are gonna have to tell me in the comments, because everything about that ending sounds like a depressing horror show to me. For what it's worth, I am fully on Team Return to Avernus. I don't agree that Karlach's story is about her accepting death. She does accept death, at least as much as any normal person should be expected to. Not only does she acknowledge that death is part of life for others.
I'm so glad Shadowheart's ordeal is over. It'll be a long time before she'll come to terms with all this, but at least now, she can start. Free of Shah.
But she's explicit about her personal relationship to it as well.
If you said I could die right now or live 1,000 years in the Hells, I'd choose to go out now with my freedom intact. I don't expect anyone to understand that. But I've been dealt a hand most people don't have to contemplate playing.
Yes, obviously she doesn't actually want to die, she is afraid to. But what relatively healthy young person who just got their life back after years of servitude wouldn't be? I definitely do see the argument for why Karlach's story might be about accepting death, I think that she's a poor character to attach that message to. I more closely associate themes of hope, determination, and persistence with Karlach. 3 things that very much conflict with the idea of accepting death. She makes it clear that if she can't live life on her terms, then she'd rather not live at all. And I think that that is really the crux of her narrative. Karlach has to learn that she can't just hide away from the inevitabilities of life, not the inevitabilities of death. She has to come to terms with the fact that as much as she may want to, she can't just smile or smash away her problems. If she wants to live, really live, then she has to do the work to sort out those problems, even if that work is going to be unpleasant. You might argue that sending Karlach back to Avernus is actually a fate worse than death, but she actually makes it very clear to us that she'd be willing to go back if it were for a good cause.
The hammer's in his house of hope. If we wanted, we could steal it right out from under his nose.
Of course, when she gets down there, she's uncomfortable, but she is able to withstand it with the help of her friends, which is great foreshadowing for my preferred ending. But I do think that that nuance is often lost or misconstrued in the chaos that is the 3rd act of Baldur's Gate 3. And that's no fault of the player, that's just kind of the nature of the mess that is Baldur's Gate as a city and its questlines, but we'll get to that. What also tends to get misconstrued is the base level of who Karlach is as a character. Yes, Karlach is a bright, bouncy, positive force in a party full of morally gray miscreants, but she's got a deep, dark inner world full of just as much fear and baggage as everyone else. She just hides it better from us and evidently herself. When playing as Origin Karlach in the full release, there's a really interesting bit of insight, literally, if you rest before picking up any companions. Karlach is lying on her bedroll, celebrating her escape from the Hells, and passing an insight check gives us this bit of information from the narrator.
You can't hide it, even from yourself. You are deeply unsettled by that thing in your brain.
What stands out to me about this line is obviously that bit at the beginning.
You can't hide it, even from yourself.
I feel as though this is a major aspect of Karlach's character that her detractors tend to miss. It's more subtly hinted at when you're not playing as her, but it is still there. There's also the use of soul coins, which Karlach sees no problem with. She encourages the player to let her use them in battle, despite them literally being the souls of the damned. And then there's her penchant for shiny, powerful objects.
Nice one, Shadowheart. That thing in your pocket seems powerful as hell.
She isn't just a ball of happiness. There's a darkness there, for sure. A lust for life that can very quickly turn into selfishness if left unchecked, and I find that really intriguing. Man, it is raining out there. I know you guys can hear that, but we're just gonna get through this together, okay? But while I have been quite complimentary of Karlach and her story so far, I'm obviously not totally happy with how her story turned out. First and foremost, I'm still pretty bitter about the state of the game's finale in the initial release. If you weren't around for those early days just after the game launched, then you probably don't know that Karlach didn't really have an ending at all. You could still choose to go to Avernus with her rather than letting her die, but it was an immediate fade to black with no further cutscenes like the one we eventually were gifted. And there was no epilogue party either, which meant her fate was just a total question mark. Later patches resolved this immediate issue, but obviously, even in the current version of the game, there's one huge element of her story that's left totally unresolved, and a whole bunch of smaller quibbles that I feel deserve to be addressed. So let's get into my reimagining of Karlach's story. Part 3. What could have been? One of my biggest complaints about Karlach echoes the same complaint that I have with Will, which is that she just needs a lot more content. Act 1 is by far the strongest in the game in terms of pure Karlach content. I quite like her whole fake Tyrian paladins plot and the way it intertwines with Will's quest. Killing her does feel adequately impactful, and they really lean into the brutality of it all with a horrific cutscene. I'm not even fully sure I can show you guys what it looks like without getting demonetized. She has a lot of great dialogue reacting to Mizora and Will's choice to let her live, and she's got plenty to say to Raphael when he comes knocking on our proverbial door as well. She immediately makes herself known as a powerful ally, a fast friend, and an experienced devil hunter. Hunting down the Infernal Iron is a fun little quest, and it even adds some dimension and personality to some of the other tiefling refugees. Specifically Damon, who ends up being so charming in his own right that a lot of people actually ship him and Karlach together. And the addition of her not being able to be physically touched is a nice touch. It's great. If there is one thing that I would change in Act 1 for Karlach specifically, it's the way that things play out if you manage to recruit her before Will. As long as you don't go up and speak to Will after defending the grove from the goblins, you can bypass him and head straight for Karlach. Picking her up before adding Will to the party means that you'll no longer be able to find him in the grove, and he will instead show up that night in camp to try and kill her. The interaction then plays out basically the same way it does otherwise, and it's cool that they added a few extra lines of dialogue to personalize the interaction, but I find this kind of cheap. I don't understand why Will wouldn't still be at the Grove logically, and it would have taken very minimal effort to add in a scene where he addresses her if you brought her there. I say it would take minimal effort because they already wrote and animated the scene, and it's in the game. If you play as Origin Karlach and speak to Will at the Grove, they have a short scene together where Will basically tells her to watch her back, and he promises he'll find her and take her down.
For the sake of these children, I'll stay my blade. Go and enjoy your breaths while you can still take them. Trust me, I won't be far behind.
So why not just add that into the game if you're playing as Tav? Like, I don't understand. Make it make sense. Also, Origin Karlach should have some kind of a quick moment of realization when Will shows up for the Grove fight. There's no, quick aside where she clocks that this is the man that was tailing her through Avernus, and I just think that that's a small missed opportunity, but these are petty problems, and the petty problems do follow us into Act 2. The fact that Zariel has apparently just given up on looking for Karlach altogether by the time Act 2 rolls around is very strange to me. We get a Gith ambush after what goes down at the creche in Act 2, and I think that it would have been just as easy to send some of Zariel's infernal servants to hunt down Karlach. And we also get a mention of Flo the Garroter, Karlach's supposed Cambion friend from back in Avernus, who forces Karlach to listen to sad stories in exchange for soul coins. And we also have the Measles, whose whole thing is garroting. But the two aren't connected at all, and the only thing that ever really comes from any of that is a few lines of dialogue from Karlach, which demonstrates the lengths that she went to in order to stay sane in Avernus.
I knew never to let my guard down around her. She always made me laugh, even when I least wanted to.
With one or two extra bits of dialogue, this could have been turned into a real connection. Maybe Zariel had tasked Flo with capturing Karlach, and Flo decided to send the Measles to do her dirty work. It could have added to our sense of danger and given us a clearer picture of Zariel's wide-reaching power, but nope. Flo gets a shout-out right at the very end of the game, depending on your choices, but that's about it.
I might have an in with one of the guards, though.
You may remember my old friend Flo. Not sure she'll help us, but maybe.
It's just another small missed opportunity, but it adds to a much more significant issue, which is that I actually think that the villains in Karlach's story are pretty weak. That probably sounds really stupid considering one of them is the literal lord of the underworld and the other is one of the main villains of the game, but let me explain. First, let's look at Zariel, and by that I mean let's not look at her. While Zariel is mentioned extremely early on in the narrative by both Will and Karlach, unlike Blackith, Shar, or Mistra, this cosmically important figure in the story never rears her hellish head. And that is just exceedingly strange. Those who are unfamiliar with the lore might not even know who Zariel is. And while treating her like a boogeyman whose name brings about terror and anger is great in theory, that build-up should be resolved. We should eventually see the monster behind the name, and we never do. At the very least, I'd have loved for Zariel to show up of Blackith style at camp and threaten Karlach with eternal torment if she doesn't return to Avernus. That would give Karlach the opportunity to affirm her stance that she'd rather die than be a devil's lapdog again. And if you've been screaming at your screen for the last couple of minutes trying to tell me that there's an in-canon reason why Zariel doesn't want Karlach back in Avernus, this next bit is for you. I am very aware that the given reason for why Zariel eventually gives up on hunting Karlach is that she actually wants Karlach to defeat the Absolute. So she's basically just letting Karlach just take an extended vacation on the material plane to unwillingly do her bidding.
Savor her company. Who's to say when Zariel might change her mind?
But if you've watched my Will video, then you know that I actually would prefer if Zariel allied herself with the Absolute, and I know that the lore purists in my audience are scandalized by that idea, but allow me to plead my case. I think we all know that Baldur's Gate 3 plays it pretty fast and loose with the established canon. They change pretty major elements to better service their story, and I'm totally cool with that. It's my understanding that in the lore, Zariel wouldn't want to ally herself with the Absolute because that would mean her supply of souls for the Blood War would dry up. Mind Flayers don't have souls, and the Absolute's whole thing is, you know. However, we also know that Zariel used to be an angel, and her penchant for war was exploited and corrupted until she became an archdevil. But she can be persuaded in the Descent to Avernus campaign to once again take up her angelic nature, meaning we have canonical evidence to suggest she's capable of changing one way or the other. So what could the Absolute offer Zariel in order to persuade her over to their side? Well, I think it would be the same thing that it offers to everyone. Complete and total control and assimilation. The Blood War itself is about control. The devils are trying to beat back the chaotic demons, keep them from pouring onto other planes of existence, and maintain control and stability in the hells. Devils prize control very highly, and Zariel only entered into the war in the first place out of a desire to stop it. I think that it's very plausible that Zariel, after all of these years being bound to the hells, would find some kind of twisted comfort in the idea of turning the entirety of existence into a single hive mind. And what's more is that the entire material plane united under the impossible might of the Absolute would actually be able to contend with the demons if they were to win the Blood War and start showing up on other planes. Basically, on a really messed up level, I think that the Absolute could actually be a really effective barrier between the hells and the other planes, and I think that Zariel could be persuaded to believe the same thing, which would also make her a much more present figure in Karlach's story and the overall narrative. I won't be so bold as to suggest there should have been a Zariel boss fight, though. While that may have been really cool, I think it would have been a better fit as part of a theoretical piece of DLC if that had ever happened. But let's not get too distracted with possible future video topics. Karlach's second villain is obviously Engr Gortash. I do like Gortash as a villain in the broader story, but his connection to Karlach feels tenuous at best. The details of their relationship, how it came to be, and why he decided to sell Karlach to Zariel are all very fuzzy, and they could have benefited greatly from just a few more expository dialogue lines. Ideally, those lines would be accompanied by a flashback sequence similar to the one Shadowheart gets in the full release, wherein we see a young, streetwise Karlach being singled out by A handsome younger man with a quick, easy smile. But that feels like too much to ask for any companion that isn't God's favorite princess. So I'd instead settle for some information from Gortash's parents, who can be found within the city. They could fill us in on Gortash's side of things at the very least, and then upon hearing his side of the story, Karlach could give her account of the events as well. I do, however, really enjoy how her and Gortash's plot comes to a close.
I feel like there should be a sunset for me to ride off into. Or an orchestral swell, or something. But there's nothing, is there?
After taking the ultimate revenge on this man, Karlach isn't satisfied. She feels empty, and I really feel like that supports my assertion about the themes of her story. Gortash's death wasn't a comfort. She wasn't able to smash through her problem, and now she must keep on living and search for a real solution to her pain. That is poignant and beautiful, and it would have been even better if we understood the nuances of their relationship a little more. And now we've come to the conclusion of her story. I've already told you what I think of Karlach's main 3 endings, but what I didn't tell you is that I have a huge beef with how it actually plays out in-game. You all know I'm a Lae'zel lover, so imagine my surprise when I showed up at the docks, took Frog Mommy's offer to ride off on a red dragon to defeat Vlaakith, and then I had to sit there and watch helplessly as Karlach burned to death on the docks. This is definitely really high up on the list of the most baffling decisions in this entire game. Like, why could we not have waited around for 1 more minute? Like, why do these events happen in the time that they do? I don't understand. It makes me unfathomably angry. So the obvious solution there would be to just not do that. Larian, please don't do that. Let us accept Lae'zel's offer, but say goodbye to our companions first. That way we can either be there for Karlach when she passes, or have Will volunteer to go with her to Avernus, just as we can if we don't fly off with Lae'zel. Like, my god. So I guess that's it, right? That's the end of my reimagining for Karlach's story. Don't look at the timeline. Don't look at the time remaining on this video. We tweaked her story, and I touched on her presence in Early Access, and discussed these circumstances under which she was rewritten, but I guess that we never really touched on what her story could have looked like before she was rewritten. Part 4. What could have been Tinfoil Hat Edition. Yeah, so I tricked you all. My reimagining of Karlach's story has barely begun because my actual ideal version of her story includes a whole lot of content that was either hinted at or allegedly cut from the game. And when I say allegedly, I mean I'm about to sound like a full-blown conspiracy theorist, so strap in. Let's start with the facts. Fact 1. Karlach was sold by Gortash to Zariel because she wanted to test her infernal engine, but it's unclear what Gortash got out of the deal. Fact 2. Gortash then went on to develop the Steel Watch, built in part by using Hellfire engines made of infernal metals, more refined versions of the ones in Karlach's chest. Fact 3. The Steel Watch was built by the Gondians, and there are multiple references to the Gondians having some kind of facility in the Upper City. From this, we can extrapolate 2 things, one reasonable and one not so reasonable. The first and most reasonable is that Gortash likely sold Karlach to Zariel in exchange for learning how to work with infernal technology so he could build the Hellfire engines that power his Steel Watch, which I find to be a really cool bit of world building if true, and I would love for it to be a confirmed part of the story, as told either through that aforementioned Karlach flashback or via Gortash's parents. It would help to bind Karlach, Gortash, and Zariel more tightly together narratively, and it would make her story all the more tragic because the price of her enslavement would be the domination of a city. Her city, no less. The second extrapolation that we can glean from these facts is a little less reasonable and actually pretty controversial when it comes to fans of Baldur's Gate 3, and that is that the Upper City was originally planned to be a part of the game, but it was cut when it became clear that it was out of the scope of development. So Larian has never really been upfront about whether or not they actually planned on including the Upper City as a playable area, and data miners have not been able to find any definitive proof that it ever existed. The most scrutinized piece of evidence is this post-launch community update on Steam, which reads, "It was always our intention for the Upper City to be an epic, cinematic epilogue, bringing the story of Baldur's Gate 3 to a close. But we didn't talk about that in advance because it would have been a major spoiler. We feel confident that there's enough content in Baldur's Gate 3 and the city itself, clocking in weeks-long playthroughs at a time, but that's not to say Baldur's Gate 3 didn't see cuts just as every game." Which sounds pretty cut and dry. They always intended for the Upper City to be a cinematic epilogue, not a vast playable area. Case closed, right? Well, No. I would like to submit to the Court of Tinfoil Hatters a second piece of evidence, a pre-launch community update, which reads, "It's been about 20 years since we last had a pint at Elfsong Tavern or crawled through the sewers beneath the city streets, and, as you might have spotted during the PC Gaming Show, many of these locations are back, and many new ones are waiting to be discovered for the first time, giving you a chance to explore the menacing roads of the outer city, the opulent estates of the upper city, and the dark alleys and pubs of the lower city. Your Honors, I rest my case." What's wild about this is that those updates were posted within 3 months of each other. And while it's true that Larian could have just been using marketing spin when they mentioned exploring the upper city, that just so isn't their style. They aren't the sort of developers who promise things they don't think they can actually deliver on. So either I'm wrong and they were just talking up a feature that they never intended to implement, or the upper city was at some point in development and then cut before release, and I'm inclined to support the latter. I personally believe that Cazador's palace was originally part of the upper city, because it doesn't make any sense for us to only be able to access it from a random guard tower in the lower city. Why isn't there some grand entrance for us to saunter up to? And more relevant to our discussion today, I believe we would have been able to find the Gondians in the upper city after rescuing their families from the Iron Throne prison and blowing up the Steel Watch foundry. Their purpose there would of course be to try and fix Karlach's freaking heart. I have been waiting the entire video to rant about this. Please admire my restraint. So yeah, obviously the most glaring omission from Karlach's story is the inability to fix her heart. It's a topic brought up frequently by first-time players who complete the game and leave confused as to whether they just missed a plot beat or forgot to turn in a quest. Because it really does feel like a raw edge on the tapestry that is Karlach's story. A forgotten, unfinished thread. And it's infuriating because the Gondians are obviously the perfect people to go to for help. They've been building infernal engines this entire time for Gortash. They can fix her. They have the technology. This genuinely feels so obvious to me, like, there is no way that there wasn't at least a draft phase where this was a possibility at some point in development. If it were fully up to me and the most ambitious version of my reimagining of Karlach's story, there would be 2 pathways to get the Gondians to aid Karlach. You could go the evil route, leveraging your status as a true soul, and scare them into complying with your orders by murdering one of their own upon arriving at the Steel Watch foundry, or you could go the good route, rescue the prisoners, blow up the foundry, and meet the Gondians in the upper city, which would actually exist. They'd be grateful for your help in liberating them from Gortash's clutches and offer their expertise. Either way, they would examine Karlach and tell us that what she has in her chest is a rudimentary version of the infernal engine that every Steel Watcher has burning in theirs. Basically, it's a prototype, and that means that Karlach was just a test subject. This would also tie in nicely to Zariel working with the Absolute, since it would suggest that she's helping Gortash along with his plans to take over the city by experimenting on her own soldiers. The Gondians would tell Karlach that they can fix her heart, and to do so would be to completely remove the one she has and replace it with a new one. The only problem is that her current heart is so unstable that pulling it out of her would kill her. To do so safely, they need to configure a specialty part from a rare material that not even Gortash has supplied them with. They'd have to get it straight from the source, the Hells. Luckily, there's one place we might be able to find this material that's already in the game.
This house of hope.
I told you earlier that I am team Return to Avernus, and I meant it. I think it's thematically important for Karlach to have to literally go through hell in order for her to come out the other side better for it. But this way, she would still be able to confront her problems with her friends by her side, and she would be able to live out her days on the material plane, the ultimate good ending, in my opinion. I imagine that the rare material needed would be some kind of gemstone or something that Raphael keeps locked away in his boudoir, or perhaps in a place of honor in the archives. And upon first entering Raphael's domain, Karlach would say the same thing she does in the full release about being uncomfortable being there, but I'd like a little more emotion from her. There's a moment in Act 3, if you've romanced Karlach, where she finally confesses that she's terrified to die now that she's finally started living.
I've always thought I was fearless. Never scared of a fight, of the future. But dying has taught me so much. There's no courage in fearlessness. There's courage in being fucking terrified, but still going forward. Still being grateful. Still trying.
I think that we could bring that same energy to entering the House of Hope. It's important for Karlach to show us an emotion that isn't rage or delirious joy. She'd struggle to choke back terrified tears over how unfair this all is and how all she wants to do is see the world and live free. And we'd be able to assure her that we can get through this together. And if you'd already ransacked the House of Hope by the time you got the quest for Karlach's heart from the Gondians and somehow didn't loot the gemstone, then you would be able to head back in the same way you do in the full release, this time with Hope there to greet you if she had survived, and with the place transformed to better fit her personality, which feels like it should already be possible in the full release. Let me put my hat back on. You know how the House of Hope has all those portals to various realms? I am firmly of the belief that these were originally meant to tease potential expansion packs and would have served as an easy in-story way of getting us to various distant lands. And that could be why that when the game launched, we didn't originally have that epilogue party scene, because our adventure wasn't actually supposed to be over. I'm not entirely convinced that the portals as named in the full release were the actual intended DLC zones. It could have been pretty simple for Larian to just rename the portals and have the actors record some quick lines about each. But one of them does lead directly to the domain of Raphael's daddy Mephistopheles, so logic dictates that we would probably be able to get to other areas of the Hells as well, like directly to Zariel, maybe? Remember when I said I wouldn't be so bold as to suggest a Zariel boss fight? I'm just saying. The House of Hope is already in Avernus. It wouldn't be that big of a leap. Just let me dream, okay? Now that we've completed that detour, let's actually get back to the video. After retrieving the gemstone and returning to the Gondians, they'd be able to craft the necessary part, stabilizing Karlach's heart and replacing it. Unless you'd used too many soul coins. Then, after opening Karlach up and attempting to subdue her engine, they'd realize that even this new part can't help her. The machinery is too volatile from being constantly supercharged, and fixing it is beyond even their capabilities. So if she wants to live, her only choice would be to return to Hell. This is, in my opinion, the second most important detail that was left out of Karlach's story after the whole heart-fixing thing. Her ability to slot soul coins into her heart for a mid-combat power boost is set up and then just never brought back up again outside of that conversation about flow. There are no consequences for using them, despite the game making it very clear that it's a pretty messed up thing to do, effectively consuming the souls of the damned for your own personal, fleeting benefit. It would tie into the idea that Karlach needs to learn to carefully deconstruct her problems rather than smashing through them, since she doesn't give a second thought to using the coins and would prefer to use them to literally smash through things. This would be a punishment for that attitude, and a thematically resonant one at that. But assuming you don't use a ton of soul coins, then the Gondians would be able to fix Karlach's heart, and that would open up a world of possibilities for her potential ending, so let's talk about some of those possibilities. In the full release, though we can't actually fix Karlach's heart, we do get a few suggested endings for if we could have fixed it, and maybe it's just my child-free bias showing or something, but I don't think that those endings were very well thought out. As it stands in the game, you can either say that she could spend her days adventuring, or that she'd make a great mom. The adventuring makes sense, but Karlach actually expresses apprehension at the idea of becoming a mother if you do the love test in the circus in Rivington.
Kids, huh? I don't know. How about a really mean goat?
In my reimagining, if you did manage to fix her heart, we would scrap the mom idea, and the second ending for Karlach would just be for her to explore Baldur's Gate. What's both sad and frustrating is that we don't actually really know what Karlach's interests are outside of swinging swords and slinging swords. More swords. That's what I was gonna say. And I don't think Karlach knows what her interests are either. She's been living in survival mode for most of her life. She hasn't had time to figure herself out. What we do know is that she loves her city. She has friends there, and she's spent the last 10 years missing home and wanting to get back to it. Now that she's finally an adult with full autonomy, why shouldn't she use that autonomy to experience the full depth of her home and discover who she is in the process? So during the epilogue party scene, outside of all of the other possible endings that have already been established for her, Karlach would have two more possible paths. The first would be that she's been out in the wider world adventuring and slaying monsters, and the second would be that she's been living the big city life, enjoying the small pleasures of existence, maybe even discovering a surprising new passion. This could be baking, brewing, pottery, mud wrestling, I don't know, just anything that would indicate that she's learning new things about herself and living life to the fullest. And of course, if you romanced her, then you'd be part of it all. Part 5. what could have been Romance Edition. Let me start this section out by saying that I'm a pretty big fan of Karlach's romance as is. She's touch-starved, which is a trope that I'm a pretty big fan of in fiction on its own. It's used to great effect here, and it makes those story beats where you incrementally fix her engine all the more impactful. Hers might also be the most forward of all the relationships, and I say that as a chronic Lae'zel romancer.
Gods, I want to ride you till you see stars.
It's a great blend of softness and aggressive desire, and you form such a secure attachment to her that feels really real and grounded. I romanced Karlach as a half-orc for this video because I personally really like the idea of our big girl having an equally big partner that could throw her over her shoulder and carry her to safety,
should the need arise.
Plus, I've always shipped Will with Karlach, and the idea of 8-strength Will with his 2 big, beefy girlfriends is just too adorable to pass up. In that vein, I will say that I wish Karlach, and by extension Will, were polyamorous. Baldur's Gate 3 is a remarkably liberated game when it comes to sex and relationships. The Ironed Hand gnomes are gay as hell. We have freaked out drow into blood play, and a goddess whose followers practice ritualized BDSM. And I do admire Larian for taking such bold swings, but we still do need more poly options. We also need some more asexual options, but that's a topic for another video. I complained about this in my Kaga video, but the fact that they decided to make Halsin polyamorous and then make Shadowheart the only companion who's actually cool with that dynamic without coercion is really frustrating. I acknowledge that allowing us to join up with any number of companions and have them all interact romantically would be a logistical nightmare from a writing and programming perspective. So I propose that instead we just make it possible for you to be in a relationship with Will, Karlach, or both, and that they could have a relationship together. That way we'd get more rep for the poly players, and my selfish shipping dreams would become a reality. I don't imagine that we would get some kind of elaborate date cutscene with the 2 of them, but the relationship could at least be communicated through camp dialogue. Will and Karlach already have so many lines about how much they care about each other, it's basically already there.
Fail, and I'm made a mindless blob clawing at demons on the front lines of the Blood War.
No, Will. Not you. I won't let that happen. Not ever.
And with that in mind, the epilogue party scene would change depending on your choices. If you romanced Will and Karlach, and then allowed Karlach to die on the docks or turn into a mind flayer, then Will would have something heartbreaking to say about how the absence of her spirit is almost more than he can bear, and that he takes comfort in your embrace. If you romanced only Karlach, and then went with her and Will to Avernus at the end, then she would say what she does in the full release.
And you and me will get to sleep with both eyes shut for the first time in 6 months? Then again, maybe we won't sleep at all.
If you romanced the both of them and went to Avernus, then there would have to be a line in there about how she's so happy to have the 2 people she loves most in the world at her side. If you fixed her heart and romanced her, then she would talk about how much she's enjoyed adventuring or exploring the city with you. And if you romanced her and Will, then there would be extra dialogue depending on his ending. If Will becomes the Blade of Avernus, then Karlach would say she misses him, but that she knows he's doing you both proud, dispatching demons in the hells. And if he instead becomes Duke Ravengard, then she'd joke about how nice it is to have a high-up connection in the city and to walk around with a Duke on her arm. But no matter which ending you ended up with, Karlach would be a bright spot of the adventure, and her presence or absence would be supremely affecting for everyone who knew her, because Karlach Cliffgate is an incredible character, and Larian should be recognized for the work that they did with her, even with all of the rewrites and alleged cut content. Part 6. Unrealized Potential. I would like to take a moment to clarify that this is not in any way some kind of call-out video dragging Larian for not giving us more content. If anything, it's a call-out video dragging Hasbro for mistreating Wizards of the Coast and Larian to the point where Larian decided to cut ties with the company rather than continue working on the game. It's been confirmed that Larian was absolutely working on DLC, and possibly even looking toward making Baldur's Gate 4. But while we don't know the details of how things soured, we do know that Hasbro conducted mass layoffs right before the holiday season in 2023, putting most of the Wizards of the Coast team that Larian had worked with out of a job. And when Larian returned to work in January of 2024, they decided their hearts just weren't in it anymore and ended their relationship with Hasbro. Larian has been nothing but complimentary of the Wizards of the Coast team, They were apparently excellent creative partners that gave Larian the freedom to make the best game they possibly could. And it obviously worked. Baldur's Gate 3 was an unfathomable hit and continues to be relevant years after its release, which just goes to show what happens when you let artists actually make the art they want to make. But this is also a tale of tragedy, seeing as you can apparently help to make the game of the year and still lose your job if your parent company decides its CEO needs a bigger Christmas bonus. So let's all just keep supporting the artists that we actually like and ignoring the corporations that prioritize profit over people. Cool?
Fuck yes.
And that's the end of today's rant, for real this time. It was a blast to put together. I hope you had fun. I'm sorry about all the rain. If you like the way that I put stories together, maybe consider checking out some of my other work. I have a comic called The Thrall available on my website, which you can find in the description of this video or in the pinned comment. You can get a physical or digital copy if you feel like it, and if not, that's cool too. I just really appreciate you being here, honestly, so that's it. Bye! It is a testament to Bayart's skill as an actor that Karlach was received as well as she was on release. Get a blip 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 blip. Turned into a droid. Okay.